My name is Lauren Spokane. I'm the Assistant Director of the Stroum Jewish Studies Program at the Jackson School of International Studies here at the University of Washington. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor Joel Migdal, who is a professor at the Jackson School and affiliated with the Jewish Studies faculty as well.
Thank you. It's good to see you all here and to see so many familiar faces tonight. It's people who I've seen at lectures before and many other events. And I want to thank you for supporting the Jewish Studies program. It means a lot to us. It's a great honor for me to introduce David Ruderman tonight. I first became familiar with his work when he was at Yale back in the 1980s. But never had a chance to meet him until this visit, and this has been very exciting for me. Today, he's the Joseph Meyerhoff Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Pennsylvania, and also the director of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Now, at first I was going to list his awards and publications for you, so you'd have a sense of what he does and his tremendous productivity, but I realized that that would take up the entire lecture hour, so I'm not going to do that. And what I'm going to do instead is try and recap for you in my own words and the way I understood it, what happened on the first evening, on Monday evening. He will also be summarizing it, but I think these are going to be two very different summaries. I will say, in going over all those publications, that one of the central themes of David Ruderman's work has been the investigation of how forces and ideas that originated outside the Jewish world, especially the ideas of the Renaissance, made their way into Jewish life and deeply affected the Jewish world. And you can see that theme running through the lectures today. So now to a little recap for you of Lecture 1. The lecture was a play that unfolded in 4 acts, illuminating the extraordinary book still very much read by many Jewish groups and peoples around the world, Pinchas Horowitz's Sefer ha-Brit. First act, Professor Ruderman showed how and why this mystical text of Kabbalah tackled science and the natural world as its subject. It approached the connection of the natural or lower world to Kabbalah, the higher world, as coming through Kedusha, holiness. So science itself was seen as originating in a kind of mysticism, what he called the Hermetic origins of science, and the connection, therefore, of the modern science and Kabbalah was a clear guidepost for Horowitz. Act 2 shows the strong connection Horowitz had to non-Jewish, especially German sources. Here, Kant is very important because for all of Kant's emphasis on rational philosophy, rationality, he sees the limits to rationality. In other words, Kant created a space for not only the philosophy of the natural world through rationality, but also for something non-rational, for Kabbalah, as a legitimate mystical philosophy in a separate realm. And Horowitz saw this validation or legitimation of this space for what he does as extremely important. The third act, we learned of an amazing story of a non-Jew, Prince Leopold zu Braunschweig, who gave his own life to try and save another person who was drowning. And the story became the basis for a 60-page chapter in Sefer ha-Brit, which argued that ahavat re'im, the love of one's neighbors, applies not only to love of other Jews, but love of all mankind. It created a link, a kind of highway for Jews to the non-Jewish world through a universal brotherhood or humanity. And finally, Act 4 showed how the broad reception of this book in the Jewish world, 40 editions in the Sephardic world, in Yiddish and in other languages, how this wonderful book permeated through diverse, heterogeneous communities of Jews. And Professor Ruderman's argument was that the book provided a kind of space, a broad space, where these very different kinds of communities of Jews could all engage in one similar challenge that they all faced. And that challenge was the rush of the modern world and the importance of finding a way to embrace that, engage it, and still maintain your Jewishness, your Jewish identity. So I'm very pleased to present David Ruderman, speaking on Behind a Bestseller, Kabbalah, Science, and Loving One's Neighbor in Pinchas Horowitz's Sefer ha-Brit. David?
So, are we turning off this mic? Or should I keep this mic on too?
I'm going to turn that off.
Okay. So go to the beginning. Whoop.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm
Hold
going
on
to bring it.
1 second.
Mute, mute. So that's the mute. This is the mute. Yeah. Okay, it's off. Computer.
You're all set.
Okay, and I just do it this way, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. Joel, thank you. That was masterful. I bet I couldn't do that with one of your lectures. So you took part one of the second night away from me already. That was that was great. So how many of you were not here on Monday? Oh, so it's a whole different group. Oh, interesting. All right. Okay. So that's why you summarized so well. All right. So I'm going to reinforce that summary. But here's what I'm going to do. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Joel Migdal. I've also heard about you for many years. I'm glad we finally caught up with each other. And those of you who I know here already, it's great to be with you. And those of you I don't know, it's also a pleasure. It's really an honor to be a Stroum professor here. I said that 2 nights ago, and I say it again. And I think Pinchas Horowitz would also be honored by getting 2 nights before a Seattle community audience. So on his behalf, I accept this honor as well. All right, so now here's what I want to do. You're a little big to run a seminar with this group, but I'm actually going to teach some text, and I'm going to sort of go a little deeper than I did last time. I'm going to try in my own way. So I have 4 parts tonight as well. Since I want to make it a little different, I'll call them parts and not acts this time, but it's more or less the same thing. The part 1 is my own reinforcement of a kind of summary. So those of you that weren't here will get first Joel's, which is probably much more clear than mine, and then mine. And then after that, I want to provide an introduction about the history of the printed book in Jewish culture. I'm going to be very broad sweeping here, but I have actually a chapter in my last book, which if you're interested, you can take a look at it, which is hopefully a nice introduction to the subject. But I want to introduce that and then to turn in part 3 to 2 roles that Horowitz plays, which I define as being part of his role as a modern Jewish writer. Number 1, he becomes involved in the printing of his book in a way that is really unusual and quite interesting and exciting. And I'm going to show you that with a text. And second of all, he sells the book. And that brings me to the last part, which is looking at the reception. In other words, I mentioned it last time, but now I want to really show you some texts where this book appears in the 19th and the 20th century. And how it invades every corner of Jewish life in all kinds of interesting ways. So we are talking about then the career of a modern Jewish book, a modern Jewish author, someone who is not necessarily portrayed as a modern Jewish writer, but I'm calling him that, and I will reinforce that hopefully with my remarks tonight. So we're going to, part 3 and part 4, therefore, are going to be looking at texts. And part 1 and 2, you're going to have to listen to me for a few minutes. So let me just take a look at my watch so I see where we are, and let me begin. I had this up last night. These are the 2 editions, the first page of the Book of the Covenant by Pinchas Horowitz. The first edition is from Bruno in Moravia, 1797. This is, I think, Vilna, the 3rd edition, 1807. And it is, if you can read it, Sefer ha-Brit Shalem. You will hear how the 2nd edition was pirated, and Horowitz was really mad. And he decided to write 350 pages more, and he added it to it, and to outsell the 2nd copy, which had been stolen from him. And he is really incensed, and his anger appears throughout many pages in the Sefer ha-Brit, and is part of his interest in how to sell a book, how to protect a book, how to license a book, how to hold on to authorial rights, and indeed, when he describes the great sins of the Jewish people in Ahavat Re'im, in the love of neighbors, one of the great sins is people who steal other people's books. But of course, he never was in a university, so he doesn't know how it works. It's anyway. So we're going to talk about all these aspects. So let me begin in my own way to reiterate, but not as well as he did. I'm just going to make a couple of general comments, but I want to make sure that I think the 2 of us can reinforce what I did last time for those of you that were not here. I think what emerges in this book and makes it unusual is this triangular relationship between Kabbalah, Jewish mystical ascent. There is a kind of journey here, a mystical journey that he is describing from the material world to a higher world where one imbibes the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, and a relationship with the natural world and science, and particularly scientific discoveries, new inventions, which he is absolutely fascinated with. And then the third aspect, and I really want to connect them, even though it's not obvious they're connected, is his moral cosmopolitanism. That is, he argues in a rather unique and rather courageous way that to love one's neighbor does not mean loving Jews, it means loving all humanity. And it means that before a Jew can enter the world of this divine spirit, one must cleanse himself, so to speak, by embracing the entire world, the entire human race. And I would argue that there is a connection between his emergence in the Kabbalah, his interest in the natural world, and his moral cosmopolitanism, if I may use that term, or universalism, or whatever word you want to use. That is, by loving nature and by embracing nature and by seeing manifestations of spirituality in God and nature, one also embraces other human beings, the diversity of the human world as well as the natural world. So that you would hope that someone who is ecological, who is concerned about our planet and cares deeply about trees and birds and animals would also care about human beings. At least theoretically, that seems logical or possible. So therefore, I don't see these as 3 elements that are separate or somehow artificially grafted together. They seem to flow from each other. And that, to me, provides us with the rhythm, with the excitement of the book that he has created. So that's my first point. I want to speak a word about his empiricism. So some of this is actually, I'm reformulating it so it's not simply a repetition of last time. Why is a Kabbalist interested in science? And here I want to focus on his empiricism. Namely, what is neat about science is that it always overturns itself. Everything is tentative. So there was Ptolemy, and now there's Copernicus, and there's Galileo, and now there's Newton. And all of a sudden, we have new paradigms, right? We have this remarkable shift in terms of the way we understand the natural world. He likes that because that provides us with a certain tentativeness. We are not so clear. In other words, what disturbs him are philosophers that claim to know the absolute truth. That's what's wrong with the world. that they really don't appreciate their own finitude, their own limited understanding. This, of course, is appreciation of Kant as well. Science is not about absolute knowledge. Science is about problem solving, very much in the Karl Popper sense, if any of you know the history of science, that essentially these paradigm shifts, as they are called, continue to flow, and this reveals not the certainty of science, but essentially the fact that there is a God who sits and laughs at human efforts, that there is a God who understands and provides new insights into his world, but only reveals a bit at a time, and we are always challenged to rethink it and so on. So for him, scientific discoveries, new ideas, things that didn't exist in a previous generation, a new understanding, a new comet, a new invention, is what excites him about the natural world. And this, therefore, brings him closer to appreciating his faith and also resting on the kind of knowledge which is, of course, beyond science, in metaphysics, but based on his faith, on a Kabbalistic faith, on understanding, and as Joel pointed out, the linkage between the cosmological world, the spiritual world, and the material world provide clearly a bridge between one sort of knowledge and the other, and we rise up to this higher journey to appreciate God himself. That, of course, brings me to Kantian Kabbalah. As I said, it seemed like a very strange way of talking about Kabbalah by quoting Kant. But Kant provides the kind of philosophical justification for overturning philosophy. We don't know what is beyond our own experience. We only can know what is known in the natural world, the world that we know through our own empirical sight, and nothing more than that. And that allows, of course, then, for the mysteries of the world to emerge in their full glory, and we can believe in them without being challenged by philosophy or by rationalism. In other words, good philosophy defines the limits of philosophy, defines the limits of what we can know and what is beyond our human capacity. There's also another argument he throws in, which I didn't mention last night, which is an historical argument. Here again is a traditional Jew who uses both contemporary philosophy, that is Kant, and also contemporary history. He spends a great deal of time in dethroning a myth which pervaded Jewish thought at least up until the 18th century. And the myth is, and Jews used it especially during the Renaissance, but also during the Middle Ages, the myth is all knowledge comes from Sinai, or all knowledge comes from Jerusalem, not from Athens, not from Rome, but from Jerusalem. And indeed, Aristotle and Plato, this was a very powerful myth among Jewish thinkers in the Renaissance. Aristotle and Plato, and Cicero and Quintilian, because rhetoric was a big area of interest in the Renaissance as well, all of these fields were learned ultimately from Israel, from the source of Israel. This is Jewish chauvinism at its best. Everything is Jewish. And the Jewish contribution to civilization, that whole motif, which has a long history in the 20th century. Clearly, thus, Aristotle and Plato went and conferred with Jeremiah and learned their philosophy. And more precise, we have a wonderful Renaissance text in the 15th century by Messer Leon, who argues that essentially, if you want to know rhetoric, which became, of course, a very important subject for the humanists of the Renaissance, read the prophets, read Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. They were the great rhetoricians. And essentially, Cicero learned all of his rhetoric from them. It's very nice. Everything is, and therefore, everything that you learn is really ours in the first place. We lost it because of the diaspora, but essentially by learning it, we regain it and it becomes ours again. Great rationale for studying the outside, bringing it inside. But Pinchas Horowitz is smarter than that. And by the 18th century, he simply says, oh, I can walk around now a little bit too. I have a little freedom now. I have a hand mic. See, both sides. Pinchas Horowitz says, this is Norishkeit. I don't know if he used that word. This is silly. Athens and Jerusalem are not the same thing. In other words, the separation of what becomes known in the history of modern Jewish thought as Atticism or Hellenism and Judaism. They're not the same thing. This motif, by the way, is picked up in the 19th century, especially by the modern Jewish thinker I actually mentioned 2 nights ago, Shadal, Samuel David Luzzatto. And he is very, very firm. He says, you know, don't read the Bible philosophically. You're mixing two worlds, 2 fields. There are the Greeks and there are the Jews, and never the twain shall meet. So what Horowitz is doing already by presenting an historical argument, philosophy developed in the classical world. It wasn't a Jewish discipline. And essentially it was grafted onto Judaism. So even though he loves Maimonides and medieval Jewish philosophy, he appreciates the fact that they took something from the outside and they essentially distorted Judaism. And essentially to create the Judaism that for him is the essence of being Jewish, one must remove the philosophical part. Not natural philosophy, not science. That's okay. Jews always love the natural world. Hashamayim misaprim kavod el. The heavens declare the handiwork of God. Or mi besarai echezeh Eloha. You know, all these expressions of the Bible. From my body I can see God. In other words, there is always a sentiment about nature. Natural world is one thing. Natural philosophy is one thing. But not the metaphysics of Aristotle and Plato, which comes from the outside. So therefore, for him, the separation, using an historical argument to try to redefine the nature of what Judaism is. Now, whether you accept his position or not, he is using history and philosophy in very interesting ways. And clearly, his position in the 18th century is going against the grain of hundreds of years of this myth of Jewish superiority, that it was all Jewish, that philosophy was Jewish, that everything is Jewish, and so on and so forth. It isn't. Let's call a spade, and therefore it doesn't work that way. Finally, as far as my summary is concerned, this was part 1, the issue of morality and ethics. I talked about that, I think, enough the first time. It is a remarkable text. I tried to place it within the context of 18th century German Enlightenment thought, Lessing, Freemasonry, and so on. That's just a suggestion. I still don't think this text can be pinned down exactly, but it is a very unique text, and it has a long history. And if one places it in the context of attitudes towards the other within Judaism, it is remarkably unique. And it is unique not so much because it doesn't appear elsewhere. It does appear, particularly among liberal Jewish thinkers, from the beginning of Reform Judaism on, and other liberal thinkers. But this is not a liberal thinker. This is an Orthodox Jew. This is a Jew who is a mystic, who is a Kabbalist, who comes from Vilna and dies in Krakow. He's the one that articulates this position, and that's why it's really quite unique. And it suggests the possibility that even within the bowels of traditional Judaism, even within the inner world of Eastern European Jewry, one might identify these universalizing tendencies that are very much a part of Jewish thought. And you will see in terms of the reception of this text, who reads this text and who appreciates that particular chapter, Ahavat Re'im. So I think that's by way of summary. So that really was part 1, and I took a little much time, but I think I did reformulate a little bit more. So those of you that were here the first time hopefully got a little bit more. Now let's move on. Now, part 2 is about a remarkably exciting subject, which came to me very late. When I came to the University of Maryland, no, that was my first job. The second job was at Yale, and the third job was the University of Pennsylvania. I was trying to talk about the University of Pennsylvania. When I came to the University of Pennsylvania 18.5 years ago, I encountered a seminar at the school and 2 professors that had an enormous impact upon my professional life. One is a man named Peter Stallybrass. The other is probably the world-class historian of this field, Roger Chartier from the Collège de France in Paris, who comes to Penn every spring semester. And they ran a seminar called The History of the Book, The History of Material Texts. I, of course, had known about this field before, but I hadn't spent a great deal of time reading in it. But what happens, which is always wonderful, all my graduate students, and I had many at Penn, all studied with these 2 guys. And when they began to write their dissertations, they were deeply influenced by them, and they even served on their graduate committees. So all of a sudden, they were learning about the history of the book, and I had to learn it also. And that's the way, of course, a teacher should learn from his students. But this is a field that has exploded in the history of the humanities. And those of you who are general historians or know something about the history of the book, of course, know that I'm speaking about very simple things that have been around for a long time, at least from the 1960s, when Elizabeth Eisenstein wrote her great book about the impact of print on Western civilization. She got into a lot of trouble, a lot of dissidents against her work, but the work is still a path-breaking, a pioneering work, which opened up a field of study. What I'm describing, for those of you that are not historians, is an interest, and it really comes out. I mean, I was originally, and I still am, an intellectual cultural historian. But the study of the history of culture involves now the history of the book. And here what I mean, the history of the book as a material text. That is, how many books were sold? How were they produced? Who were the printers? How was the page formatted? Was there an index? In other words, the process by which books are produced, looking at the materiality of the text, and what we can learn about the process of reading, about the process of circulation of ideas from the materiality of the book that we're speaking about. Now this, like all of Jewish studies, we're always a step behind, but we catch on eventually. And this field has become quite dominant in the field of Jewish cultural history, in the last 20 years, 25 years or so. And I want to mention just a couple of works. If you're interested in a kind of summary of some of this stuff, I'm not selling books or anything, but in my early modern Jewry, which is a kind of synthesis of the early modern period, I have a long chapter called Knowledge Explosion, which really kind of sets this up in a better way than I can do it this evening. But as you will see, it's quite relevant to my discussion of Horowitz, which is chapter 3 of this evening. So let me just spend a few more minutes on it. What I mean to say, to give you an example, a more concrete example, if one would turn, I mean, first of all, Jews, when did Jews first begin to print their books? When was the first printed book in the West? Any suggestions? Yeah, when? How many times? Well, just give me a million dates here. Give me just one. Printed, yeah. Well, we're talking about the Gutenberg Bible, obviously, right? So what was that? 1440s, 1450, something like that, right? What was it, 14? Or the dean says it's 1454. It has to be 1454. All right. So when was the first Hebrew book? Now we're silent. What? 1470s, or maybe even earlier, late 1460s. So in other words, the Jews were au courant. They really got it very quickly. They didn't wait. When was the first Muslim book, the first Arabic book? Yeah, almost like 200 years later. I mean, there were all kinds of inhibitions about printing books in Arabic. But Jews had no inhibitions. They immediately picked up. You know what it reminds me of? Who were the first Jews to use the internet to sell Torah? Chabad, the Hasidim, the Orthodox Jewish community, right? I mean, they were the first, long way before Reform Jews, before conservative Jews. They immediately picked up the discovery, a new technical discovery. Here's a way we can now do Daf Yomi on internet, right? You know what Daf Yomi is. You study a page of the Talmud every day. So now it's all done, through internet. I was just telling Joel at dinner, how did I discover the importance of Sefer ha-Brit? I went on a chat line called Bechadrei Charedim. Anybody ever look at that chat line? It's in Hebrew. It's the Charedim, the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem, have a chat line on internet. And they were discussing, of all things, Sefer ha-Brit. I mean, can you imagine discussing Sefer ha-Brit in 2012? Whatever its sources and so on, and going back and forth. It just blew my mind that these guys are... So there's something about, so Jews pick this invention up and they make it their own. And the books that were published before 1500 are called incunabula. And I could really describe a whole bunch of them, but I won't. But the point is that from very early on, the book became an attractive alternative. What it does, and here I really can't describe a whole lecture on this, but essentially what it does is to create a kind of revolution in the way Jews transmit knowledge, in the which they educate themselves. Let me just give you one or two examples. And much of this, I mean, there are several young scholars who are working on this. If I'm talking about the materiality of the text, I should start by speaking about Professor Jaffe from the University of Washington, who I still haven't met, but I know he's a great scholar and I read his books. He talks about orality and the written text in antiquity. But this is, turn off your, thank you, technology, you see. Last time you announced you turn off your phones, but they're off. Okay. So he talks about the transmission of oral to written and so on, particularly orality, in a very important book that he wrote. But I'm speaking here about the history of print. So there are a whole group of scholars. One of them I want to mention is a professor at Tel Aviv called Elchanan Reiner, who argues, for example, that one of the earliest books published in the beginning of the 16th century was a book called the Mikraot Gedolot. This was what we call the Rabbinic Bible. You have the Bible in the middle, you have the Aramaic translation, and you have on the sides various medieval commentaries, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Kimchi, and so on. And this book is published in Venice, and it's transmitted to Eastern Europe. So all of a sudden, these Eastern European Jews are picking up, what's going on here? We just study Talmud. We don't study Bible directly. That's for little children. But now we have the Bible text. And then we have all these commentaries on the side. Well, Rashi, he's one of ours. But who's this guy, Kimchi and Ibn Ezra? He's not one of ours. There's some Jew from the south, a Sephardic Jew. Sephardic Jews, they're not our tradition. Our tradition in Eastern Europe is strictly Ashkenazic. So what printing does in this remarkable example that Reiner has discussed is to open up, is to make Jews aware of other Jews and other Jewish traditions. So the internal Jewish traditions are clearly opened up. Let me give you one more example, which is perhaps the most remarkable example of the 16th century. The Shulchan Aruch. What is the Shulchan Aruch? It is the great code of Jewish law written by Joseph Caro in the 16th century by a Sephardic Jew, who also happens to be a mystic, and he ends up in Safed. What is exciting about the Shulchan Aruch is the edition that comes out in Krakow. The Shulchan Aruch means literally the ordered table. And what we have is a kind of commentary, a gloss called the Mapah, the tablecloth. So you need a tablecloth if you're having a table. And that is written by a rabbi from Krakow named Moses Isserlis, the Ramah. So you have Caro and Isserlis. You have a Sephardic rabbi joining hands with an Ashkenazic rabbi to create a work which will make permanent the merger of these two traditions. Now, there's much more to say about this, and I'm not going to teach the Shulchan Aruch tonight. But I want to say what of the power of a book to bring together traditions that were always divergent. These communities did not speak to each other. Remember, the tradition of Jewish law was preserved by Maimonides in the South, in the Sephardic world. And his Mishneh Torah was the ultimate code of Jewish law, and it remained sacrosanct in there. But all of a sudden, now we have a Shulchan Aruch, which becomes the standard code, guide to Jewish law for all traditional Jews. And it is a merger of these two traditions. This is the quintessential early modern book, right? A book that brings under the cover. And what the other interesting aspect of this, and then I'm going to stop talking about this history, is essentially the tradition of studying the texts was a free-flowing oral kind of thing. A teacher teaching commentaries upon a text, etc. What Isserlis tried to do was to take this living tradition and to encapsulate it in his commentary so that the Ashkenazic viewpoint would be expressed in this Sephardic code. What emerges is therefore that reality. However, he arrests the process of the fluidity. It doesn't continue. It doesn't change. It doesn't evolve over time. It becomes sacrosanct within the confines of a book. The book arrests what had been a living oral process. So these are only two examples of many that I could give. I mean, the expansion of the Jewish library, the kind of books that are being published in different languages, in Yiddish, later on in Ladino. Yiddish is an early modern experience. The Yiddish press in Amsterdam. You wouldn't think Amsterdam is a major press for Yiddish. Yiddish book dealers would come from Eastern Europe, and in Amsterdam, of course, you know, it's open. Everything is open, right? You can get all the hash you want, all of the women, everything. You can also publish any book you want. Amsterdam is really a cool city. And they came, and they stayed, and they published a Yiddish book, and they brought it back to Eastern Europe to sell it. Because these were mobile book dealers that were involved in a book trade, which becomes part and parcel of the culture of early modern Jewry. So all of this goes on then within the context of the printing press. The printing press, therefore, has an enormous impact upon the shaping of Jewish culture, in bringing Jews together, in the mobility of ideas, in the transformation of Jewish culture. Now, of course, those who really know the history of the book know that you can exaggerate this stuff. No invention has that much power. The manuscript doesn't go away. The medievalists would say, well, you know, there was also mobility of ideas and manuscripts in the Middle Ages. I'm ready for any of those arguments because I've heard them many times before. But nevertheless, one must argue that one of the features of this period from the 16th, 17th, 18th century is the creation of books, the creation of a book culture, the creation of a class of book peddlers, and also the creation of what I would call secondary elites, namely now that it is easy to publish books, and we have, of course, the same thing going on in the Christian world, but this is, in a sense, that mirrors it in the Jewish world. Every darshan, every preacher, every folk preacher can now publish his great sermons, and he can put them out and sell them in a little small book, and we have all of these kinds of books and his amulets and his potions and all kinds of folk culture. And he can write books for children and for women, and he can write in Yiddish, which then becomes a language which more people can appreciate and read. And this whole culture of the book, therefore, emerges in all kinds of interesting ways and insinuates itself into every crevice, every corner of Jewish culture. And thus, Eastern European Jewish culture, which is much more insulated than the Western culture of Italy or Amsterdam or elsewhere, are linked not only through the mobility of persons, which is also a part of the early modern culture, but also the mobility of books. And therefore, we are speaking about a revolution in Jewish culture through a technology and through the extraordinary enthusiasm in which Jews begin to create their own books. And one final word about this subject, which is equally important, and that is the enthusiasm of Christians in the Hebrew book trade. Christian Hebraicism has a long history, which is also medieval and goes back into late antiquity. But in the early modern period, we have an extraordinary interest on the part of Christians who are selling all these books, who are producing all these books. Take, for example, the great Antwerp Christian Protestant Daniel Bomborg, who comes down to Venice and creates the famous Bomborg Press and publishes the first Talmud, the entire Talmud, and the first Mikrot Gedolot, the first rabbinic Bible. This is a Christian. Why is he doing this? Does he love Jews? No, he wants to make money. Essentially, it is a money-making enterprise. And indeed, Christians are reading Hebrew books. Renaissance is not only a renaissance of Greek and Latin to a great extent, it is also a renaissance of Hebrew as well. So that what emerges in this period, also because of these books, is the emergence of the Christian reader, which is also a part of our story. So this is just to give you a little glimpse. Now you can really read my chapter well, but no, you really don't have to. But to give you a little taste of how significant this subject is for the study of early modern Jewry. Now that leads me to part 3, finally. How are we doing for time? Part 3 is about this. Now I want to place Horowitz in the center of this world. It's much later. It's the late 18th century. But here's a guy that knows his books. He knows his printing. He's very much a part of the printing industry. He knows how to format a book. And he is concerned about specific instructions on how this book should be produced. Here is a man who is also a salesman. Part of the success of this remarkable book with 40 editions is because he aggressively sold the book. Already in the first edition of the book, he has at the bottom of the page, here is where you can buy the book, and he gives you 12 agents in 12 different cities, all of his friends who are selling the book. So he is quite aware. He's out there to sell books. You will see, and I will mention it later on, in the first review of this book, which appeared in Ha'Ma'asef, which is the journal of the Maskilim, of the Jewish enlighteners in Berlin, The reviewer he says many positive things about this, but he makes a derogatory comment about authors who are not taking their books to bookstores, but are selling them on Amazon, or the equivalent of Amazon in the 18th century. They essentially go to the rich Jews right from the start and sell their book directly and are avoiding the middleman right in the middle. And he's, of course, referring to Horowitz. He says he's implying that Horowitz was so successful because he was selling his book to rich Jews directly. All they had to do was call it up, order it up, and they sort of delivered it the next day. So there's something going on here. So in other words, you can't really appreciate this book. This is a mystic who lives in the material world of book selling. That's the point. And now here I want to show you this. I gave this, I took this text, I translated it for our History of Material Texts at Penn. And Chartier, the great Chartier, was sitting there, and he read this with me. And he had never seen anything like this in any Christian book. I mean, he was absolutely amazed that a Jew would be writing this. So what I want to do, I'm not going to read it all with you, but start to read it yourself. So here's the context of this section. The first edition was published in 1797. And then in 1801, 1802, the same publisher published the book without Horowitz's permission. Horowitz had gone to great lengths to protect this book. He went to 7 rabbis. Most of them he had met in the West, in the area of Amsterdam and The Hague. He had spent a year there. And through his connections of Eastern European rabbis who had relatives in the West, he put together a list of 7 rabbis, and he asked that they would write haskamot. Haskamot are approbations, arguing not only that the book is beautiful and wonderful and worthy of being bought, but also that no one for 15 years can publish this book because God says you can't publish it, and it's protected by rabbinic sanction. That obviously didn't bother the publisher in Brno, who went ahead and published the same text, and it came out in 1801-1802. Well, and the problem with it, and I have to add one more detail, Horowitz tells us that while he was traveling through all of these different towns writing the book, he contracted some kind of eye disease, and he was really sick for a while, and he couldn't read, and he vowed to God that if he were to publish a book, he would publish it in the greatest humility without his name on it. Now, whether he meant that or not, I don't know, but I'm taking it at face value. And indeed, I showed you, I don't have it tonight, but I showed you last time that he sort of spelled out his name on the bottom, but you had to read the first letters of each word. He kind of hid his own name, but it doesn't appear on the scene. So now in the second edition, the pirated edition, his name's not there. So people say, well, who wrote this book? Well, maybe it's Moses Mendelssohn, the great philosopher. Maybe it's the Grog, the Gaon Elijah of Vilna. Horowitz was from Vilna himself. The Gaon Elijah of Vilna, of course, was the great opponent of Hasidism. He was also a Kabbalist himself, but he clearly was opposed to the Hasidim. Clearly, it wasn't written by the Gra, nor was it written by Mendelssohn, and Horowitz clearly felt bad that his ego must have been shattered in the fact that his name was not on it, and now someone was stealing the book. So the third edition came out, and he added many, many pages, and he wrote a new introduction. This is from the second new introduction to the book, and at the end of the book, he's going to tell us, you're not going to screw around with me anymore. If you're going to publish this book again, you're going to do it my way or no way at all. I don't know, as I said, I certainly don't know enough about the Hebrew book, but I certainly, in the non-Jewish world, these kinds of instructions are unusual. And what's also unusual is the fact that you have to read it in Hebrew. I mean, I translate it as best I can, but it's written with a biblical idiom. And those of you that can read the Hebrew into my English translation can appreciate how lovely this prose really is. And those of you who can read Hebrew should get the book and see the original. But let's just take a quick look at this. So you can read, this is my Brit. Again, he's using the word covenant. In printing the second edition with additions, I do not come to extend and lengthen the duration of the prohibition on publication for any more years. This was the original 15 years that the rabbis had given him. Thus, beginning in 1809, and subsequently, it is permitted for anyone to publish it. This is my desire in order to increase the Torah and to enhance wisdom so that intelligence will grow among my people. But this will only be satisfied by the publisher if he will fulfill the following conditions, which I enumerate below. So now we're not going to read them, but the paper will be good, the letters will be large, et cetera, et cetera. Read number 5. The end of the first part should be published on the same page with the beginning of the second part. The end of part 1 should conclude in the first column, and the second part should begin in the second column of the same page so that they will be united and not separated. One part shall not be separated from the other, nor should the first part from either the second or the second from the last. And I'm skipping down. Each part of this book is not like the other, since I've carefully preserved the order of God's redemption in it and is connected from the beginning of the first part until the end. And thus all the words of the second part are dependent and rest on the words of the first part. Enlightened minds will not comprehend anything without part 1, and the first part is only an introduction to the second part, and so on and so forth. In other words, he goes on quite at length on this. The book is continuous. It's not really an encyclopedia at all. You don't just pick up and read here and there. In other words, you are, and the word redemption, I think, is critical here. This is a journey you're on. This is a spiritual journey. In this respect, and maybe Bob Stacy would confirm this, it's more like a medieval encyclopedia rather than a modern encyclopedia, in that it is a kind of spiritual ascent. And therefore, you have to read everything from beginning to end and read it in order, not to jump all over the place as we would read encyclopedia. But let me go on, because there is a lot here, and I'm not going to be able to read all of it, and I've got to watch my time. There should not be an index of any chapter or discourse regarding any specific matter or another, or to a specific page. One should not follow the practice in this book for 2 reasons. First, because most of the matters in this book are not concentrated in one place. One detail is mentioned in one place, another elsewhere, and they are not contiguous to each other. Thus, they will be inaccessible to a reader who will be unable to locate them through a table of contents, and so on. Moreover, with all of this, one may find many words of Torah and fear of heaven in the first part devoted to human wisdom, and much human wisdom in the second part devoted to Torah wisdom, and so on and so forth. So here again, no index. Again, the notion of continuous reading, and that you are creating one chapter is building on the other. And having an index would interfere with that by simply fragmenting or simply selecting parts when the totality of the experience is absolutely critical. Now, go on. Number 7, format of the book shall be quarto. I'm not going to comment on all of this because we don't have the time. Abbreviation shall be seen in the book, except for those already in the text. One should never introduce any abbreviations, even those well-known ones such as AC, which everybody knows, in Cain. One should be careful never to print one letter instead of a complete word. He wants perfection here. This is a spiritual journey, and therefore no abbreviations. Number 9, there should not be a word missing a final letter in the entire book. One is forbidden in this book to draw a meaningless horizontal line, what he calls a kav tohu, above the word indicating that the last letter is missing, as the custom of other books. In other words, this was a typical printing way of doing this. You get to the end of the line, and you sort of cut it off and indicate that there's like a letter missing. No, no, no. Everything has to be perfect. And you who cling, and here he's speaking about midabek. Atem hadvekim badonai. Those of you that know the expression, you who cling to God, right? But here he's using the word midabek to the Lord your God. I swear to you, if your hearts are aroused to add even one abbreviation or to leave off the last letter of a word in this book and to put in its place a line above to indicate the missing letter, or to fill the empty space at the end of the line with a letter that begins the next line, please be careful with such things in this book. Rather, set all the letters of each word and attach them, and so on and so forth. Notice the meticulousness by which he proceeds in presenting how he wants the book printed. I have then, number 10, seen the stress. That is the pressure applied in the printing press. The craft called press and zeer, pulling the lever, and here I need an illustration. I don't have one. Pressing the lever to press the type into the paper. I am disgusted with my life, and of course this is hard to translate. He's taking it from Genesis 27. Because of their pressers and pushers, most of whom are slothful and will not press with full human strength so as to make a good solid impression on the paper with ink equally uniform across the sheet. If you want to see how this works, you must, when you're in Antwerp, Antwerp's one of my favorite European cities, The great Plantain Museum there of the history of the book is an extraordinary, it has reconstructed a printing press from the 17th century. And there you will see how exactly this would come alive, or what he's talking about here. Thus the reader can only make out what is marked, while the ink will only reach the border of its destination on the paper as ghosts, rifa'im, that is, weak impressions, will arise in the printing press. Consequently, the printer should be carefully supervise his pressers, and he should order them to push and press hard the printing press with a strong hand so that the paper can fully absorb the letters on the wooden board. With courage and good force, one should fortify weak hands. And again, this is biblical language, so you can't really appreciate it when you translate it into English. One should carefully supervise the proofreader who will do his holy work with good concentration, free of wandering thoughts, and should forbid anyone to speak with him regarding essential matters, business affairs, or even the affairs of kings at the time he is proofreading. Wow, I wish my books were produced this way. Woe to the chirpers and moaners. This is from Isaiah. Woe and desolation is destined for the proofreader who reads falsely and acknowledges a mistake. As long as I'm living on the earth, no one should make a shortened version of this book or a section of it. He should never produce a single discourse or part of it to stand alone. One who shortens it will shorten his life, and one who divides it will divide his years. The most important point is that it should be proofread very well. So we should maybe give this to a copy of this to the director of University of Washington Press. All right, so now I come to my last part, and I know I'm running out of time. It's 8:30. I'm going to only go on for about 10 minutes. I ran out of time. I didn't think I'd have enough to say tonight. So now I want to talk about readership. This is a great topic, and I began to jump into this and go all over the place, all over the Jewish world in the 19th, 20th century. And I have so many different texts here. I talked about this first one last time at the end of my remarks. It is a great story. I call this selection. So here I'm giving you examples of readers and how they read Sefer ha-Brit. And I want to show you the impact of this book on several generations of Jews. So I'm jumping to the 20th century. In fact, Dan, who is our Cole Fellow, knows this book very well and actually teaches this period. From Awakening Lives, it's a beautiful book of autobiographies of Jewish youth in Poland before the Holocaust. And here is a young boy named Chenech writing in Yiddish in 1934. He was a student at the Chofetz Chaim Yeshiva in Radon, a very famous yeshiva. And there he obtains a copy of the Book of Covenant, and he runs to the toilet to read it because he's afraid if his master sees he's not studying Talmud, he'll get rebuked. And he memorizes the entire text, you recall, those of you that were here. And he becomes a maskil. He becomes the bee expert on all the sciences. Because like a good yeshiva bacher, here is the modality of his learning is to memorize the oral way of learning these texts. And thus he can recite, you know, birds, bees, elements, animals, everything is in there. And he becomes considered to be, you know, one of the experts in his field. Go down to number B, and I'm just going to throw out just a statement or two on there. I have too many texts here to talk about, but I just want to show you the range of material. This is from the Yiddish edition, the first paragraph of the Yiddish edition of Sefer ha-Brit, Warsaw, 1898. All the sciences of the world, the heaven, earth, and oceans, including all living creatures, are clearly explained above all the precious divine accomplishments with which man is crowned. The famous work was written in holiness and purity in the holy tongue by the pious scholar and Rabbi Pinchas of Vilna of blessed memory. We have no idea that he was a rabbi. The present work shines augustly in the Jewish skies like the sun. As the work was printed the first time anonymously, the rabbinic sages believe that the great the Gaon of Vilna had composed it. And to make it easier in the eyes of those who do not understand the Holy Tongue, this work has now been translated into simple jargon. Jargon, of course, is Yiddish. By the well-known translator, Rabbi Yosef Meir Yavitz, the translator of the Mishnoyes, the Midrashim, the Chok Yaakov, and the Ein Yaakov. In other words, here is a real kosher Jew who publishes Sifrei Kodesh, who publishes holy books. This is a holy book. I mean, for him, this is a holy book now in Yiddish, so that a good, pious Jew can read it and learn about nature. So you see already the patina of holiness by which this book is understood. All right, a few more. Now this is unbelievable, and I can't do justice to this. I don't have the time anymore. I'm going to just go on for 5 more minutes because I think I was supposed to stop around 8:30, according to the schedule of our boss. And that is Chatam Sofer. I don't know if you know who Moses Sofer was. He was from Pressburg, Hungary. There's a very attractive picture of him. 1762 to 1839. Chatam Sofer was one of the leaders who emerged after the Reformed Jews published the first prayer book in German at the beginning, in the first decades of the 19th century. And he and a group of his Orthodox rabbis attacked it violently and said it was a great heresy which the Reformed Jews were committing. Later on, involved in his embattlements for Judaism, he pronounced the following: Kol chadash min haTorah asur. That's a pretty conservative position. Anything new is forbidden by the Torah. And here is Chatam Sofer, according to the testimony of his grandson, writing the following. Here, the grandson is speaking about his grandfather. He was an expert in the science of measurements, algebra, and the calendar. In this, he was quite efficient and able. He was also proficient in astronomy and physics and began to compose a special book on these sciences so that it would be handy to his students to study from it without having to consult Gentile authorities. But when the Book of the Covenant was published, he examined it from beginning to end and declared that anyone who desires to satisfy himself in various sciences should acquire it. For I and you are indebted to the author, since I was able to acquire much valuable time in not having to write a book like this for myself or for you. But that's quite an endorsement by a rabbi who we would picture to be extreme, right in the extreme Haredi group. Chatam Sofer is clearly the arch enemy of change in the context of the 19th century. I'm not going to go into this now, but what I had prepared for you was to show you, and this is through the help of a young scholar in Israel who has been studying Chatam Sofer, most recently, Ma'oz Kahana, a professor, I was going to say at the Hebrew University, but he might be at Tel Aviv University, but a brilliant young man who has written his dissertation on this rabbi. And he pointed this out to me, the text of Sefer ha-Brit in the first edition, and then in the response of Chatam Sofer, understand correctly and be angry at the author of Sefer ha-Brit, who was mistaken in what he wrote in the 4th section, chapter 10, beginning with the words, behold, etc. And then if you look at the second edition, you will see it's changed. So that would indicate there was actually a conversation. That indeed Horowitz visited Pressburg, where Chatam Sofer lived, and that he edited the second volume, and I'm sure we would find other revisions, because he had not paid sufficient attention to the mystical understanding of a prayer. He argued that, you can't, this is all silly if you're a scientist and so on. He was talking about a particular piyut, a particular liturgical poem, and obviously Chatam Sofer didn't like that. And therefore, he adds in the second version that you must understand this text not only literally, but also its deeper, holy, mystical message. So apparently, there had been some kind of exchange of information between Chatam Sofer and Horowitz. Let me just run through these very quickly, and I'll be done very shortly. Joseph Pearl was a maskil who was one of the opponents of Hasidism. He originally was a Hasid himself. But then he gave up Hasidism and became a satirist, making fun of Hasidim running around Europe and so on and so forth. What I must tell you is that the Hasidim embraced Sefer ha-Brit, and particularly Nachman of Breslov. The Breslov Hasidim still run around today in Israel with their white yarmulkes, their big white yarmulkes, and they sing and they dance, even in the secular streets of Tel Aviv. And Nachman of Breslov left no one to inherit his throne, so to speak, so he became a kind of messianic figure. He became a kind of, this was a Hasidic sect, the Breslov Hasidim, that didn't have a Rebbe any longer. So Nachman was still alive in their hearts in every form and shape. Nachman of Breslov continuously quotes Sefer ha-Brit throughout his writings, and also his student Natan of Nimerov. So both of them are deeply embedded. It's very interesting. Sefer ha-Brit criticizes Shabtai Tzvi and the Frankists and the false messiahs of the 17th, 18th century. But he doesn't say a word about Hasidim. And he could have said something, either bad, good, indifferent. Perhaps here, too, he was selling his book, and he simply didn't want to infuriate any of these groups. So the Hasidim read this book. Now, Joseph Pearl tells us a story making fun of Hasidism, about lightning rods. You see this number E here. A man not known to the Chassid described the instrument which stops thunder or lightning. I do not remember which. The people then asked him, from which did such an invention come? He responded with his speculations and nonsense, so that it seemed to them that they were great thoughts and inventions, while I pretended not to hear anything. When he left, I said to the people who remained that there is no need to search for remote explanations and discoveries, for according to my view, there is a simple explanation. It is known that thunder beats in a place where there is the klipa, the outer shell concealing the divine light within all creation, hence the evil realm in Kabbalah. So he gives a Kabbalistic explanation to the notion of lightning rods. The lightning rods comes from Sefer ha-Brit. There's no question about it. That's where he learned this information. He twisted it around, of course, and made fun of it, that these silly Hasidim were finding some kind of mystical explanation of it. In Horowitz's explanation, lightning rods are explained scientifically, how they capture the lightning coming and protecting the roof of houses and so on. But clearly, there's no other way he could have got this. This is a unique reference which comes from Sefer ha-Brit. A couple more, I'm going to stop. Solomon Schechter, the founder of Jewish Logical Seminary of America. All right, any good conservative Jews here? There are a couple of conservative rabbis. It was my dream of my childhood, and this is written in English, when I learned through the Sefer ha-Brit and the letters of Chag Vidaver, that was Henry Vidaver, an American rabbi and Hebrew writer, and the Hebrew Weekly Hamagid, of the existence of a continent on which, according to my simple calculations, people should stand on their heads and who yet somehow managed to walk erect and free. He's speaking about the globe, about the circumference of the globe, and how, you would think that if you go from one part of the world to the next, you'd be standing on your head and so on. In other words, here was a simple Jew who grew up as a traditional Jew, and he first learned about the New World by reading Sefer ha-Brit, okay? And he became a modern American rabbi. First an English rabbi, and then a modern American rabbi. And finally, two more. The author of Sefer ha-Brit was Pinchas Horowitz. This is a very cute story which appears about 3 times with different characters. May his memory be a blessing. When the book was first published, it appeared without the author's name. Again, that was a stumbling point. One time, a deceitful person came before Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch, the head of the rabbinical court of London, who had also previously been the rabbi in Berlin, a rabbi who welcomed maskilim, enlightened Jews, into his rabbinical court, and bragged that he was the author of Sefer ha-Brit, that is, the person who was visiting the rabbi. But the rabbi knew he was a liar, since he knew the name of the actual author, Pinchas Horowitz. He honored him by offering him an opportunity to present the novel ideas in the book, but the man had nothing to say. The rabbi then declared to him, "You are only the sandak." That, the sandak is the one that holds the baby at the brit, right? And you are not the Baal ha-Brit. In other words, making fun of the word Brit. Brit meaning circumcision, but also Brit meaning the book of the covenant, namely the author of this book. And finally, and this is really quite amazing, I don't know if you know who Rav Shach is, Eliezer Shach. Did you ever visit, when I was a child, when I was 18 years old, I visited Bnei Brak, and I went to the Pontovich Yeshiva to see how Jews study from the world of traditional Judaism. Shach was the great rabbi of this yeshiva, an Eastern European sage, an extremely traditional Jew. You would not expect Rav Shach to be reading our little book here, but here is the story. Rabbi Matisyahu Solomon, the spiritual guide, Mashkiach Ruchani, I love that title, that's better than being professor, a Mashkiach Ruchani, of the Lakewood Yeshiva in New Jersey, reported that he first saw this book on the desk of the Honorable Rabbi Shach, the ultra-Orthodox rabbi and head of the Pontovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. And when he, Matisyahu, began to look casually through the book, the rabbi told him, "The book shall never be removed from my desk." When the Mashgiach asked him the reason for this, he showed him the following passage in Sefer ha-Brit, section 9, chapter 16, on the length of the exile and the hope for the coming of the Messiah, and said of himself, "When I read his words, Horowitz's, it serves me as a chizuk, as a support for the correct approach to our being still in exile." So of all things, I would read this book for many reasons, but I wouldn't read it to find the Messiah in it. But clearly for this rabbi, he perhaps captured something that I have not captured. This notion of this mystical journey, the notion that there is something about this book that is messianic in character, that is spiritual in character, that one is on a journey when one enters into the world of science and the scientific world and takes steps forward, cleansing oneself through mystical contemplation, through morality, through loving non-Jews, ultimately to reach the final destination. So for this rabbi, not the science, certainly not ahavat re'im, the love of neighbors, none of these are worthy of mention, only the fact that I learned how to wait for the Messiah until he comes. In other words, the messianic message of the text, which is really, a very side message, it seems to me, the way I read the book. But of course, I didn't read the book like Rabbi Shach. I'm very different than him, I think. So let me bring this to a close, and forgive me for going on for so long. But here is, for me, the magic of this little book. I am really quite impressed that you could sit through 2 lectures, or maybe some of you only 1, but nevertheless heard me speak about this little book and my fascination with it. I hope my argument still holds some water or is more convincing to you at the very end, namely that this book does present a kind of modern view of the world, or at least takes a few steps forward, but presents it in a very traditional way. And this remarkable merger is what makes it really quite unique, and also gives us an insight, plus, in addition to the aggressive salesmanship of the author, in how this book reached so many homes and was picked up and referred to by so many different kinds of Jews. I've only given you a very, very small sampling here. The last thing I want to say is what I began with, and that was that it seems to me those who study modern Jewish intellectual history need to refrain from categorizing or pigeonholing what we consider to be the canon of intellectuals, or this one is secular, and this one is religious, or this one is Sephardic, and this one is Ashkenazic, and this one is mystical, and this one is non-mystical, and so on. But to appreciate the complexity of Jewish culture and Jewish thought, and how the many roads of Jews entering the modern world, of how they proceeded, both moving forward and moving backward, moving sideways, and how an individual like this, who is clearly not the original thinker, like a Moses Mendelssohn or a Martin Buber or a Franz Rosenzweig or an Emmanuel Levinas, but nevertheless, this individual also captures something about the reality, about the journey of Jews, as well as other human beings, but certainly Jews in this case, of entering or walking into the modern world, of struggling with it, of surviving within it, and of trying to find their own identity within the context of this larger space and the new cultural challenges that they were to face. So if I've introduced you, now all you have to do is wait 2 years, and I promised the University of Washington Press to get the book next year, and then hopefully it'll take another 2 years, and you can actually see this little book emerge, not the Horowitz book, but the Ruderman book. Thank you very, very much. You have time for questions or whatever? Yeah.
Happy to take questions.
You don't have to ask questions. I don't see people running up.
With the proliferation of all the translations of Hebrew books, Kabbalistic books, traditional Sefer Kodesh into English, what is your personal explanation why this book has not yet appeared in full in English?
Why is it in English? Yeah, I don't know. I think I mentioned to you, I spoke once on this book in Washington, D.C. At an audience of primarily Jews, and they really got incensed that it wasn't in English. And one guy came up to me and he said, here's a check. I want this book translated to English right away. And I didn't take it. I said, I'm not spending my life translating this book. And he said, well, I'll get someone to translate it. I got the money. And he was really pushy. And then he sent me several emails afterwards. And I said, it's not just about translating this book. It's about, I mean, as you see, there are many layers of understanding. You really have to know something about Kabbalah, about Lurianic Kabbalah. You have to know something about the world of science. You have to be able to identify his sources. You have to be able to extract, page after page, where he's taking his sources from and so on. It's a big job. I'm really touching the surface here. I don't think I'm going to devote in my little book that I'm going to write on this book the kind of textual work that is necessary. When I began as a scholar 40 years ago, I always thought that every Jewish scholar must translate one text into English. That's part of our role. And in fact, I did it. I published a 16th century text called The Valley of Vision in English. It was published by, actually, in the 80s by the University of Pennsylvania Press. It was a Baroque Jewish autobiography of also an ascent to heaven, but a totally different book than this. But it took me 10 years, and I got all kinds of things wrong, because when you translate something, you have to know everything. And you can't hide what you don't know. When you don't translate the book, you don't have to do that. But I did it, and then I put it out in Hebrew as well. It was, no one bought it. No one was interested in it. The Haredim on the chat line, they read it in the original Hebrew. They don't need it. It's interesting. In our world of scholarship today, less and less of these projects are going on. When I was at Yale, we had a series called the Yale Judaica series, which were to be translations of classics of Jewish life. This series has not continued to publish its book. We have the Prisker edition of the Sefer ha-Zohar, the Book of Splendor, which Danny Matt has been putting out volume after volume. Whether you can actually read that book and understand what's going on, I don't know, in English or in any language, I'm not sure. And I don't think Matt would have continued unless this family was supporting him, and he could leave his academic post and devote full time to it. Now, it's an unusual situation to be in that wonderful situation of simply translating a book for the rest of your life. So I don't know if translations have gone out of vogue. Why was this book not put into English? It was a book that was obviously read primarily by traditional Jews who could read the original. However, I mentioned Yiddish, and we read a little bit of Yiddish. Ladino parts are really interesting, and I referred to this in my first lecture. The first Ladino translation was a translation only of Ahavat Re'im. It came out as a special text, only the chapter on loving one's neighbors. Was published in Ladino, and then later on, 3 editions appeared afterwards. But it was put together, as I said, with Robinson Crusoe and a variety of other moral tales, which these readers were reading this book, not again for science, but for its story value, for its entertainment value. So there we have a Ladino, but it doesn't go beyond that. I think an English translation, or at least an anthology of this material, could be useful. I do lots of translations in my own text. But I don't know if I have the strength to translate such a big book, or maybe I could find a student later on. Again, does it really have value to translate the whole thing, and will people read it? I mean, that's really the problem. The book industry and everything else has changed radically, and can we afford to put out these large books in their original form in English? We do have lots of translations of Hebrew texts, and I should mention it. Actually, the first edition just came out. A man named Felix Posen, I don't know if he means anything to you, but he has taken his money and created the Posen Library of Jewish Studies, which the first volume is coming out. He proposes 10 volumes that Yale University Press are producing, anthology of primary sources from every period of Jewish culture. And he has assembled a large team of editors, and the first volume is coming out, I think, this month. I just saw a notice on email. I don't know if there will be a selection from Sefer ha-Brit there. I have no idea. But that will be it seems to me that's the way to go, to anthologize these texts rather than present them in full. I'd love to see it, but I don't know in the world of publishing and the kind of Jewish learning that's emerging now whether we can actually do that. But as you will see, I will continue to translate these individual texts and teach them, and maybe we'll accumulate enough to really put together in one book, but not yet. You ready to go home, or you want to ask a question? One more question, and we're going to close it.
So I was intrigued by his elaborate discussion of how to proofread and how to print the words in his book. And I'm wondering if you'd comment a little bit on how you see his concept of his audience, not just who he wants to sell to, but whom does he want to understand this book by being so explicit about no abbreviations, no code.
I'm not sure I can say more than what I've said. It seems to me the book takes on this sense of kedusha, of holiness. This is part of the meticulous task of producing a perfect kind of book, because it is a perfect story and a perfect journey and a spiritual ascent. And that's how I understand it. I mean, first of all, the notion that you need to link one chapter with the next, and you can't separate. You can't break it into little compartments. You can't read a section of my message here without reading the second section in another part. And that it's impossible. I mean, every author wants his audience to read the entire book, not just to look at a little part of it and so on. But he is scrupulous. I mean, he is really fanatical about it in the way. And the business of abbreviations, I mean, this was, those who have studied the history of the book, are quite aware of how printers, want to make shortcuts and how to line up lines and so on. And they get to the end of the line, what are you going to do? You're going to reproduce the whole word? Let's just make like an abbreviation at the end and so on. And let's shorten here and there. And let's make different letters. And if you really, what you need to do is to walk into, a rare book room and get a lesson on how these books were produced and see the kind of mistakes that he's referring to, the kind of limitations that he clearly wants a perfect book. I don't know if anyone took him seriously after he died, and I really can't say, in fact, I'm almost ready to say that the later editions of his book weren't as perfect as he wanted them, for sure. In fact, they're really small print. He was also referring to a specific size of the book that he wanted to have it printed. What's interesting, what's left out, by the way, which I find very surprising because it appears in other Hebrew books, illustrations. This is a work of science. It seems to me illustrations would have been critical. And at one point, when he talks about the diving bell, he has a whole chapter on the divers who get into this very primitive diving bell and go down to the bottom of the sea, and how this is miraculous, and you can see God's under the sea under the earth and so on and so forth. And he said, I couldn't afford to print here a picture. In other words, so there's an indication that he had that perhaps in mind. But there are no pictures in any of the volumes I've looked at. So illustrations weren't something that was important to him. Again, this is about a journey through words and through connecting links and through the perfection of moving from one holy line to the next holy line. So I think that aura, perhaps, was his obsession on the one hand, but was also perhaps the reason why traditional Jews saw this as a kind of holy book and would put it on the shelf with all of these other holy books and considered it really very much a part of a traditional Jewish library. It's still really quite fascinating because I don't know of any other author who is so emphatic with these kinds of directions, which give us an indication of both his concern for this special kind of book, but also his enormous awareness of how books are printed both well and poorly. Thank you.
We learned one thing, it's that Pinchas Horowitz turned over in his grave when he heard that you want to anthologize.
Right, exactly.
I want to thank Professor David Ruderman. This was a fantastic highlight to a great series, and please join me in thanking him.
Thank you.